So we're going to be having a very special guest lecturer today. So Tim Jackson is an ecological economist from the University of Surrey. He is, I think, rather famous as being the economist that I would say has coined the term post-growth. So it's really quite an honor that he is willing to join us today. He has written several books, so one of which is Prosperity Without Growth, which is an absolute classic of post-growth. And on top of that, he wrote a more recent book called Post Growth, which was more of a poetic ode to growth and questioning why we need to grow. So it was very kind of him to join us today. So Tim is here. So what we're going to be doing is we are going to, one sec, yeah. So we are going to be doing a Q&A with Tim. So I'm going to start out by asking the first few questions. And at a certain point, we are going to open things up to questions from the room. So good morning, Tim, and thank you so much for joining us.
Morning, Melanie. It's great to be there. Kind of be there.
Yeah. Kind of be there. So I'm going to open things up with the first question, and that is just, what is your definition of post-growth? What is post-growth?
Well, I think of post-growth as a language that allows us to question what I see as a dominant cultural myth. And that dominant cultural myth, of course, is the myth of growth. And I call it a myth because it's a kind of a narrative that is so deeply ingrained in our society, in our organization, in our politics, that it is almost goes unquestioned most of the time, particularly in conventional economics and conventional politics. And so post-growth is really allowing ourselves to think of ourselves as a social organization which will change over time, and one day we won't be captured by this myth of growth. And it also of course has some very practical applications, because actually the rates of economic growth in advanced economies over the last few years have been slowing down so substantially that essentially in some countries, and I would count the UK amongst those countries, we are already in a post-growth economics, but we're not really thinking about it. So for me, the term post-growth allows us to think about that sense of moving on from the myth of growth.
Thanks, Tim. So the next question that I have is really about the role of entrepreneurs in building the post-growth economy. So my next question for you is, what role do you see entrepreneurs playing?
Yeah, enterprise is really the foundation for the way that the economy works. And so it's really important for entrepreneurs to understand how they fit into that vision of the economy and how they fit into society. And I think, previously enterprise has been seen basically in terms of short-term profit maximization by the production of material commodities that we hope will be thrown away as fast as possible so that we can then manufacture and sell some more of them. And it's very, very clear that that vision of enterprise is inconsistent with living well on a finite planet. And so, in a sense, the task of the entrepreneur at this point in time is to think what enterprise should mean when it's concerned with living well on a finite planet. And I think that that's a shift away from material throughput towards the service output from enterprise. It's a shift from profit maximization to purpose and vision. And it's a shift of the role of the entrepreneur from being simply homo economicus, if you like, the economic rational person, to being a more integrated figure in a social perspective, someone who lives in their society and whose purpose and whose vision really is to contribute to that society. And very interestingly, a few years ago, one of my students did a project interviewing entrepreneurs, particularly small and medium scale entrepreneurs. And what they found was that it is purpose and vision that motivates entrepreneurs as much as, and perhaps even more than, the accumulation of profits and money. And so I think it's a vision for enterprise that does justice to the humanity of entrepreneurs.
How do you think that startup incubation should then be modified in order to cultivate the kind of entrepreneurs that we need for this post-growth economy?
Well, I think you've written the book on this, or you're in the process of writing the book on this, Melanie. I mean, this, I have to say that in a way, it was you, Melanie, that brought me to the importance of thinking about startup money. And I worked for some time, actually. I was the chair of the advisory board for a venture capital company that was investing in the public, in energy and in the space of clean technology. And it was doing it in a very conventional way. It was doing it in the way that had its eye always on the exit. What multiples could be achieved at exit was its key indicator of progress. And what was very interesting about that particular company was that it was ahead of its time. What it was investing in was actually a series of projects which turned out to be incredibly risky because they were new technologies, because the incumbent system wasn't ready to assimilate them, because the learning curve was very, very steep. And actually, over time, that fund turned around a multiple of 1. It just about recovered its investors' money and returned it to them. It didn't have multiples of 10 and multiples of 15 that really successful VC companies are supposed to have. But as we thought about it, as the kind of group of people who were working on that thought about it later, we decided actually it was the right multiple in some sense. It was definitely a post-growth multiple. And it was one that indicated that we had paid attention to the real frontiers of technological development. Now, looking back on it, I couldn't say that it was non-extractive in the sense that you would define it, at least by design. It was designed to be extractive. It was designed to create value, sell the company, and take that value back for the shareholders. It didn't manage to achieve that, and I count that as a success, but I think it would have been even more successful if it had been designed in a non-extractive way. And I remain convinced that it's possible to design forms of financial support in non-extractive ways.
Nice. So, how do you think we should reform entrepreneurship education in the business school to facilitate
I think we should
transformation?
clone Melanie and send her out into the world. I mean, I've done quite a lot of business school talks, and they've been very varied. People who attend business schools are very clever. There's no doubt about that. They've got good qualifications. They understand the world. They know the rules of the game. They know how to play the game by the rules. And generally speaking, they will go through that system and they will be very successful in it in their later lives. The difficulty, of course, is if you invent a game whose rules are basically selfish, you will have a lot of very clever people who are going out into the world playing a very selfish game very successfully. And to some extent, I think we've seen that in the business schools of the past, sending out people who essentially have created inequality in society by playing their game really, really well. And of course, to some extent, you could argue that actually people should not be defined by the rules of a game that they learned in business school. They should actually think for themselves. They should define their own game. They should think about what they want in life. They should think about what matters in life. They should think about what matters to the world, how to play a good game, if you like, in the world. But on the other hand, while business schools are continually teaching them to play the selfish game, that's kind of what we will end up with, broadly speaking, in society. And so introducing these ideas into business schools, introducing the idea of a post-growth economics, introducing the idea of post-growth entrepreneurship, introducing actually the concept of purpose as the principal role of enterprise, talking about how to structure that purpose in the world. These are now, I think, an essential part of the education that students should be getting in business school.
So how has the establishment, including governments, responded to your message?
Oh, well, I mean, when you call something, a cultural myth, and you then set out to demolish that myth, you cannot expect awards, recognition, knighthoods, gongs, and prizes. You must accept a little bit of opposition, and I've certainly had my fair share of that. In fact, you mentioned Prosperity Without Growth. When that book was first published in 2009, it came out as a government report. It was commissioned by the UK government. Essentially, I mean, we developed the brief ourselves, which is why it ended up talking about prosperity without growth, challenging economic growth. But the broad brief of the report was to look at the relationship between growth and the environment, growth and the planet. And I mean, the reactions to that were extraordinary at the time. We had involved every government department in the discussion about the content of the report. We'd sent a copy of the report to the Prime Minister's office, number 10 Downing Street. We had consulted with the Prime Minister's own advisors about whether we could use the title Prosperity Without Growth. Was it a little bit too inflammatory? And the advisor told us, which looking back, I think you could interpret in a number of ways. He told us, I don't think it matters what you call it. And actually, the day before the report was launched, I received a very, very irate phone call, an angry phone call from a person who had up to that point been very sympathetic, telling me that number 10 had gone ballistic because it discovered that we were about to launch this report. So, that from there, you can only go upwards, I think. You don't set out as an academic or an entrepreneur to piss off your government or your prime minister. And I had obviously managed to do that. But interestingly, since then, I mean, the initial report died a death. It just, it was the most extraordinary launch of a report I've ever experienced. And I thought the report was going to go nowhere because it just disappeared. It disappeared out of the news. It disappeared out of the government's reporting. It disappeared out of almost everything except, thank goodness, the internet. And at that point, that was the point at which, online reports were beginning to be downloaded as a matter of course. And within a few weeks, it was downloaded in its hundreds of thousands and later became a book. And so it created a kind of impact that then politicians found it quite hard to ignore. And so it was almost as though, our direct audience, it was a report to the UK government, to the Prime Minister, in fact. He did not want to know anything about that report, but then actually a lot of other people did want to know about those arguments. They were interested in them, and it was humbling in some ways to find how much interest there was in having that conversation. And once the conversation had started, it was very definitely the genie was out of the bottle, and it was hard to put it back in again. And even politicians eventually had to pay some attention to it. And now I would say that they do. Sorry if you heard that. That was something falling off my desk, and I don't think it was indicative of political disapproval or approval. I would say there's more attention to it, but it's still a very, very difficult political issue. It's still very difficult to persuade politicians to take it seriously. And I would also say that that's a disaster for the reasons I was talking about before. If it's true that we're sleepwalking into a post-growth world with no understanding of post-growth economics and no understanding of post-growth entrepreneurship, then we are in a dangerous position, and a position that threatens the stability of society.
So, The internet did embrace your teachings, and of course, since then, we've also had the growth of other, I would say, related new economics streams. I mean, things also like degrowth and donut economics. What do you think, first of all, I guess, is the relationship between post-growth and these other new economic streams? And then the second question is, do you think that post-growth is finally making it in the mainstream? And if so, or if not, how can we continue in this direction?
Yeah, I don't think it's important really, the terminology, and some people prefer the term degrowth, some prefer the term post-growth. To me, I think post-growth is a little more inclusive. And degrowth suggests, degrowth in some ways is a little bit like growth. It suggests there's a dial somewhere in the treasury where you go and on a Monday morning and you look at this dial and you say, we need a bit more growth, let's turn growth up. And degrowth has the opposite sort of sense, that you go to this dial and you think we need a little bit less growth, so we turn the growth dial down again. And initially, at least, I think that's sort of how degrowth thought of itself. More recently, it's begun to be a little bit more sophisticated the way it presents itself. So it actually, much of the terminology of degrowth and the conceptual thinking around degrowth is very similar to what I would present, what I had presented in Prosperity Without Growth, what I presented in Post-Growth. And there's a lot of overlap between these two terms. And then, of course, you have, the terminology of donut economics, Kate Raworth's visualization of what an economy might look like within planetary boundaries, the well-being economy, which has as its aim well-being rather than the pursuit of GDP. And all of these are ideas which are growth critical. And so for me, I guess post-growth is an umbrella term that is inclusive enough to incorporate all of these different ideas. Is it mainstream? No, but it is becoming more mainstream. So I have conversations, post-growth conversations, in places which I could not have expected to have them 10 years ago. Would not even have thought about having them 13 years ago when Prosperity Without Growth was first published. So in the International Monetary Fund, in the World Bank, in the OECD, in the United Nations, have conversations in financial companies, in mainstream financial companies. I have conversations in mainstream consumer product companies, right at board level, board and CEO level. And those conversations are something new. They are an indication that things are shifting and that people, even in those conventional positions, are now beginning to struggle with exactly those issues that the post-growth debate confronts us with. And I think that's a positive sign of change. It shouldn't be taken as a carte blanche for a kind of growth-free future. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. We seem to be very wedded to the language of growth and even see sort of biological justifications for growth and human well-being justifications for growth. We talk about spiritual growth, and I have to say, I should make it very clear, I'm not against spiritual growth. I think that's a really good thing. So post-growth is really dedicated to the sort of myth of economic growth. And all of these other kinds of growth actually may be the language that we end up adopting because we are so keen on the word growth. But whenever we're that keen on a word, I think it's really important that we should question why we're keen on it. Are we keen on it because it has an inherent sense that it's right to us? Are we keen on it because we have been acculturated into that terminology by the institutions of the market and the economy? Are we keen on it because we're too lazy to think of something else to fix on? Are we keen on it because it really tells us something about our own vision for the future? And that, I think, is where we are with the terminology of degrowth and post-growth. We're in a place where this is a transition language. It's a language that's helping us find our way towards a different sense of the economy and a different sense of ourselves.
What do you think is the role of creativity and the arts in the post-growth economy and in post-growth business?
Yeah, I think it's really important. This is a part of what I was trying to do in Post Growth, the book, which was published last year, was to take economics out of its kind of dry rationalistic box and speak of economics as a social science, a science that tells us about ourselves and about our science, our society. And when you think of it in that way, actually, the question of creativity comes to the fore, because those creative spaces are the ways in which we imagine the future, imagine our lives, in which we question ourselves, in which we ask deeper questions about meaning and purpose and how we achieve those in society, about our visions and our aspirations for our kids and for their kids. And so that creative space is the one that frees us from the confines of conventional academic establishment thought. And for that reason it's very, very important, because we are basically very much creatures of habit. We go along with what other people think and what other people say. We go along with the structures of our everyday lives. And that habitual aspect of the human psyche plays a really important role, because if we allow it to, putting a lot of our lives into the realm of habit, means that we don't have to apply cognitive energy to every bit of our lives. Some of it is just habitual. It goes below the cognitive radar. And the idea of that in evolutionary terms is to free up cognitive energy, to think in more strategic ways, to think in more creative ways, to plan for the future, to access our dreams and aspirations, to connect them to our daily life. Now, what goes wrong really when we systematize everything and habitualize everything, including the way that we institutionalize the economy, is that we put too much of what matters into that habitual box and we don't think about it clearly enough. And the best way to break out of those prisons is the creative space. It's the arts. It's the places where we can think and feel and be moved and move other people in ways that are not rationalistic, not lined up, not habitual at all, and break us free into that, that cognitive space where we can think differently about the future.
Nice. Um, there's another question that I would like to ask, and that is, I have a whole room here full of university students. And I guess the question is, at this given moment in time, what advice would you give to these university students about how to move forward to bring a world with a post-growth vision?
Um, I think it's always a really difficult question, and whenever I'm asked it, I'm always very aware that for the most part, unless there are some, let's say, more mature students in the room, for the most part, your world is not my world. And the world that you're coming into is not like the world that I came into. So giving you kind of prescriptions from my past about, knuckle down, choose a sensible career, work hard at it, mortgage your life so that you can have a house where you later have kids, and then they can, rinse and repeat the same process. That is a kind of false way of thinking about the advice that I can give to anyone. And I'm not sure that I really, although I had that advice when I was a kid, I'm not sure that I necessarily followed it either. I do think there's something here though about, your own drive and your own ambition and the things that matter to you and the things that you're good at. So there's no one size fits all post-growth entrepreneur. There are thousands of them, hundreds of thousands of them, and they are all different. And each person, working in that space will have their own drive. Some will want to be, a small, self-sufficient entrepreneur who's really doing something that they're deeply passionate about and wanting to make that work. And others will be system changes. They will want to go into the belly of the beast. They will take themselves off and go into, some multinational company that hasn't got even post-growth on its agenda, and they will attempt to change it from the inside. Others will be accountants, some will be creative artists. The post-growth world actually is as varied as we are as human beings. And I think the trick, and it's a really, really difficult one to find the knack of it when you're starting out, is a kind of a match between what you're passionate about, what you're good at, and what the world needs from you. And being good at something you can recognize in yourself. Being passionate about something you can also feel for yourself. Recognizing what the world needs from you is slightly different, because it's a kind of listening task. It's a task of what is coming to me from the world, and which bits of that can I engage with my skill and my passion in a way that benefits not just me actually, but everyone. And so to me, that's the task, that sort of fitting of what I'm good at, what I'm passionate about, what the world needs from me.
Nice. At this point, I would like to open things up to questions from the room. Does anyone here have a question for Tim? Yes, go ahead.
Yes, I heard him talking about rationality and the Homo economicus. And I was wondering, because maybe I did not hear it clearly, but is, according to him, rationality, our personal rationality, which is usually pros and cons weighing and then choosing the best option for yourself, is rationality in origin different than other classic economists have described to us? Or is he saying that in the post-growth world, we should put rationality a little bit aside and think about the greater good?
Were you able to hear that question, Tim?
Yeah, I think I got it. So should we stick with rationality as our way forward, or should we set it aside and work on something else? Was that roughly the question? Yeah, I mean, I think, there was one of the economists that I talk about in Post Growth is a guy called John Stuart Mill. He was kind of the father of classical economics in a way, and he was called, at the time, he was called the saint of rationality, because what he was trying to do was to create a system, that was rational, that was deterministic, that was able to give us that most precious of things, which is the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. And he thought he could do it with a kind of happiness calculus. And actually, in the middle of his life, in the process of doing this, he had this massive mental health crisis. And he reflects on it in his autobiography. You can go and read about it. And what's extraordinary about the story that he tells of it is how, he woke up one night thinking actually this whole rational process was entirely wrong. It was mistaken. And even if you could somehow manipulate the greatest happiness of the greatest number, where would you be then? Because there'll be nothing left to do. It would all be empty. And so rationality brings a kind of emptiness to it, was his feeling of this. And this mental health crisis went on, it wasn't just an overnight thing, it went on for years. And interestingly, the things that rescued him from it were poetry, music, and love, basically, which were a highly non-rational things. And it was that process that actually allowed him to recover. But what he went on to do in the rest of his life was to write one of the most important books in classical economics, which is around utilitarianism, and then another book on the political economy. And so what he did, it seems to me, looking at it in retrospect, is he kind of eventually held a kind of balance between rationality and creativity, if we could call it that, emotion, passion. And I think that balance is ultimately the most creative way, the most constructive way to think about rationality. Is not to throw rationality out and to throw everything out with the bathwater, so to speak. It is to accept that it is one of the ways in which as human beings and as a society, we can and should make decisions about our future and how we work in the world. But it isn't the only one. There's a very good book called Master and His Emissary by Ian Gilchrist. And the way that Gilchrist frames it is that rationality is the emissary Rationality is the bit of our psyche that's sent out into the world to problem solve. But the master in Gilchrist's framing of it is the strategic, creative part of our brain that has aspirations about the future and should be in control of the emissary. It's the master, it's this creative side that should be sending rationality into the world to solve problems. And what's happened actually in society, and in particular in Western society over the last 200 years or so, is that the emissary is out in the world wreaking havoc without any contact with the master and no sense of strategy or creativity. And so actually it's bringing rationality into control, into command of our creative vision is the way to see this relationship, I think.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Does anyone else have a question for Tim? Go ahead.
Hi, Tim. Scientists now predict we could already pass the 1.5C degrees of global warming in 2024, so next year. How do you see the role of civil disobedience in the transition towards degrowth or post-growth economy?
I think it's very important. I dedicated a chapter to it in Post Growth partly because I think as soon as you begin to think about these questions, you understand that that rationality and the way it works in the establishment is governed by power. And so the question of power, what power is, how it's maintained, how it is threatened, how it might change, becomes incredibly important. And of course, we have lots of different visions of power. We have power in terms of monetary power. We have power in terms of political and democratic power. Quite often, political and democratic power is captured by monetary power. And that means that actually change becomes very, very difficult. And the only option in relation to that, to creating that change, as philosophers have pointed out since the time of John Locke, is civil disobedience. And so civil disobedience has a long legacy. It has a very strong heritage in Western society and in Western political thought in particular. And to me, you know, what happened in 2019, for example, with the school strikes, Fridays for the Future, what happened in Glasgow at COP26, what happened to a lesser extent in COP27, what's happening now in those movements that have been brought forward by groups working for change, actually, I think has to be, is important. In fact, I know of relatively enlightened politicians who welcome that because it gives them the license, the democratic license that they need in order to create the changes. And there was one, for example, one minister in the UK who was responsible or partly responsible for the 2007 Climate Change Act in the UK, who welcomed the activism that was happening around the act precisely because it gave it cross-party political census for change. So, you know, I think there are also dangers there, particularly dangers when in order to confront power, civil disobedience becomes violent. I'm not in favor of that, but I think the concept of civil disobedience is incredibly important to the kinds of changes that we're looking for at the moment.
Thank you. There's another question over here. I'm just going to give you this microphone, Jasper. Go ahead.
Good morning. Thank you for your presentation. Another question is that you say you don't want to use the word degrowth, and if you turn it around, do you want to use the word nature positive to restore?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that I don't use the word degrowth. In fact, I've just co-published a paper in Nature which does use the word degrowth. And I think, you know, what's interesting is the word degrowth has become something which in many ways, I mean, I do countless interviews now with, you know, magazines like Fortune and I can't remember what the other one was I was looking at the other day that I did, but very unexpected places that now have heard about degrowth and want to talk about what it means. And so they will interview people like myself and will say, incredibly clever things, and they will get clickbait from it, and it will feed the capitalist system in just the way it's designed to, just because there's a buzz around a particular word at the moment. That I'm cynical about that, but I'm not against the language, because I do think it is a way of questioning the status quo, and I think that's what we need at the moment. Nature positive is an interesting one. I mean, it has come quite far, quite fast. I think it's very, very relevant, in particular, to the concerns about biodiversity loss. And actually, it's been harder to make progress in relation to concerns about biodiversity loss than it has to make progress in questions of climate change, which is really, a kind of an accounting problem. How much carbon is there? How much carbon can we afford? What technologies can we reduce it with? With nature and our impact on nature, it's much more diverse. It's much more difficult to address. And so thinking about ourselves as contributing positively to nature, I think is a really constructive language to use. It is slightly problematic because it's difficult to execute. It's difficult to know actually what nature positive is. And when you begin to kind of commercialize and capitalize that concept, it becomes potentially quite dangerous. I mean, there are very good biological, what can I call them? Not explanations, but theses that to be nature positive, the best that you can do is to just leave nature alone, not do anything to it. There's a wonderful experiment in New Zealand, which was really kind of a shock to the whole forestry industry in New Zealand, where this one small local farmer basically left this piece of land alone. And at first, all that happened was it grew yellow gorse bushes all over it, which farmers hate and foresters hate because they don't do anything. But eventually, through this progression over 25 years, the forest re-established itself through the gorse bushes until now it is a proper virgin forest in the way that is good for nature. But what happened to allow that to happen, that nature positivity to come through, was just leaving it alone. And so I think nature positive should not be thought of as another sort of piece of language for capitalism to appropriate to talk about a sort of green capitalism and to achieve wonderful things through more human intervention, because quite often the most positive thing we can do is just leave it alone.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question. So I thought I saw one other hand. Yes? Okay, just one sec. I'll give you the mic.
Hi. I was wondering, how does the post-growth idea fit in individuals who start businesses not out of visions or aspirations, but out of need? Out of subsistence, especially in areas where people don't have easy access to education like we do, or their education levels are low because they couldn't afford to go to university, or because they just couldn't or didn't want to.
Oh, thank you for asking that question. I think it's a really good question. And in some ways, we should preface all of this by talking about the places where some growth is necessary. And I think, what you've identified there is actually precisely where growth can matter. So where in poor areas, particularly rural areas of poorer nations, with poor infrastructure, with no housing, with no clean water, with no access to clean energy supplies, with no electricity, with no schooling, it's very, very difficult to talk about that as not being a place where incomes and resources and enterprise itself should grow. That it should. It's very difficult to talk about that as a place where enterprise shouldn't grow, where those things shouldn't grow. It's clearly better. And this, to me, this takes me to one of the kind of central points, the point that I've brought out in Post Growth in particular, which is that there's something about prosperity which is about striking a balance, something about well-being which is about striking a balance. It's about, there are clearly dangers when we have too much of something. And in a sense, the post-growth debate does speak about the dangers of having too much of things, the damage to the world, the damage to ourselves, the damage to our aspirations, the damage to our creativity, the damage to the social stability of society when that too much is unequally distributed. Those are all the dangers of having too much, if you like. There are, though, obviously, and in some ways you could argue that this is what motivates capitalism and motivates development. There are needs, there are real material and social needs in society where people have too little. And in those cases, in that situation, then what you want enterprise to be doing quite clearly is giving people more access and better access to those things. Now, I think in a way, to me, the two points, interesting points that come out of this. One is that, you've gone from a position of having too little to having too much. At some point, you must have passed through a kind of balance point. You must have passed through the point at which actually that is sufficient. It does meet people's needs, and it isn't creating damage in society, like an epidemic of obesity that we know from the World Health Organization we have at the moment across the world. So, and the difficulty is that you don't know where that process, where that balance point lives. And in particular, capitalism is very hard at finding it, because capitalism is essentially built on a maxim, on a mantra, that we can always have more and more, and that will always be better and better. And quite clearly, when you're looking at this balance, prosperity is health, if you like, prosperity is a balancing act rather than prosperity is more, then it's very, very difficult to know where that balance point lives. And one of the second points, and this is where it comes right back to entrepreneurship, is that how you structure your enterprise in the context where more is important is absolutely critical. Because if you structure it in a way that builds in continued expansion, in which your survival as an enterprise in those conditions relies on expansion, then you're part of that same dynamic in which more and more becomes better and better, and we never know how to stop. And so in a sense, all of the lessons that Melanie's been talking about, non-extractive finance, about bootstrapping, about ramping up, about integrating the enterprise into the system of social needs that lives around it, that is even more important in those environments, because that kind of enterprise has masses of good work to do in delivering more to people who really don't have enough. And yet it does not want to be part of an ecosystem that pushes us continually past that boundary, that balance point. Prosperity is health. Prosperity is a sense of balance in which actually we have sufficient, but we are not destroying the world and we're not destroying society. So it's a really, really important question. When you look at the data around where income growth really matters, what you find is that it matters in those places that you have just identified, in those poorer rural communities without good sanitation, without decent nutrition, without even proper housing. And in those places, as you increase the income in those places, basic aspects of prosperity like longevity, like infant mortality, like maternal morbidity, and things like happiness even, they all improve dramatically as you increase incomes in those poorer areas. And then there comes a point at which that increase begins to stop and sometimes even reverse. And what that tells us is exactly that prosperity is a balance, that really well-being is a place where we don't have too little and we don't impose too much on other people or on the world. And finding that balance as an entrepreneur is perhaps the core of the task that Melanie has set herself in talking about post-growth entrepreneurship.
Thank you so much, Tim. I think our time is up, but I would really like to thank you for sharing your wisdom with us today, and I'm sure that there's many students here that you've inspired. Thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks, Melanie.